All right, so, and we can see if the other panelist comes, but my name is Timothy Vilgiotti. I acknowledge that I'm maybe not like the number one person to be the only panelist on the panel about settler colonialism. I'd also been on the thing. It said there were a couple other folks that were going to be were going to be presenting, but this is a work in progress still. I'm a history PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm studying the history of science, specifically the history of research into visionary plants, so plants that would normally be labeled as hallucinogenic or as psychedelic. Either one of those terms, and I'll talk about a little bit why those are problematic terms later. But I'm going to go ahead and just get at my paper. I didn't quite get time to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I will just go right into it. And I'd appreciate any criticism or feedback that anyone has afterwards, because like I said, it's very much a work in progress, and I'm still kind of developing all of the ideas. This paper examines how settler colonial projects have constructed visionary plants used in indigenous spiritual practices as frontiers for expansion, universalizing models of linear progress, focusing on the Mazatec mint plant named Xka Chon Titjon as a case study. This example fits into a process that Anishinaabe intellectual Kyle Powys-White describes as the inscription of settler ecologies onto the landscape, not just onto the topography that is, but onto the interdependent web of life it sustains. The meta-narrative of the frontier demarcates potentially lucrative areas outside the boundaries of settler control and anticipates their improvement, modernization, or development as successive waves of intrusion and violence allow for the assertion of deeper claims over territory. Indigenous land, erroneously designated as empty space, serves as a safety valve allowing bourgeois elites to channel potentially subversive forces towards their own interests of market expansion. Frontier logic constructs conflict between settlers and the indigenous people as inevitable but justified by the promise of progress and advancement. Plants labeled as psychedelic often bear an association with the counterculture, where a sympathetic attitude towards indigenous traditions and resentment towards the establishment pervades the printed literature and online conversations. By continuing to rely on fundamentally colonial assumptions about indigenous people, however, activities that superficially appear rebellious or subversive often ultimately end up aligning with and even reinforcing the processes of colonial frontier expansion. Today, as workers and executives at white-dominated social media and technology companies embrace the potential of psychedelics for maximizing their productivity, and investment firms pour money into the development of psychedelic therapies, the ideas of the psychedelic counterculture more generally appear to have reinforced the status quo despite their initially subversive intent. The pharmacology of the plant focused on in this case study, however, has proven much more difficult to integrate into Western therapeutic models than substances like LSD or psilocybin, and it continues to have an ambiguous legal and medical status. Assigning Xka Chon Titjon the binomial name Salvia divinorum and identifying the unique properties of its active ingredient as salvinorin A thus marks this plant as a pathway into a more unruly part of a collectively imagined psychedelic frontier. Its mass cultivation, industrial manipulation, and sale represent the inscription of a status as a commodity. In online debates surrounding legitimate use of the plant, the underlying premise of inevitable conflict between the modern consumer and the indigenous other, a key logical assumption of the frontier meta-narrative, presents the acknowledgement of indigenous claims to Xka Chon Titjon as a threat to its continued use by settlers, and limits the extent to which non-indigenous users of Xka Chon Titjon acknowledge the continued existence or practical, political, and economic concerns of the Mazatec people. So begin by giving some background into the history of psychedelics. Mechanistic science, which gained popularity in the European and then American imperial metropoles starting in the 17th century, in part due to its ability to rationalize the exploitation of nature, viewed the mind and spirit as entirely separate from the body. Clinicians thus treated mental illnesses as afflictions beyond the reach of medical interventions, and regarded the claims by indigenous shamans in the New World about contacts with other worlds and unseen entities through visionary plants as purely superstitious, if not demonic. The elucidation of the structural similarities between the three classical psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin, and the endogenous neuromodulator serotonin in the 1950s and 60s, provided key support for a new pharmacological paradigm connecting higher-order mental processes to identifiable but dimly understood protein complexes and ion channels in the brain. This epistemological shift concerning previously feared and repressed psychoactive substances connected inner experience to a materially and spatially bounded terrain that institutional scientists, and by extension the nation-states they depend on for support, could eventually imagine exerting control over. The frontier operates, in this case, not as an abstract metaphor when applied to psychedelic plants, but as a material assemblage of tropes, legal boundaries, and pedagogical methods for inscribing settler ecologies onto aspects of the landscape, including the dispersed assemblages of receptor signal complexes which, far from unique to humans, occur in most eukaryotic organisms, and that the receptor signal complexes are the focus of pharmacological research. Though that's generally imagined as part of the mind, in other words, receptors and molecules designed to activate or block them represent an important, if difficult to visualize, aspect of the biosphere as a whole. Marking the altered states of consciousness labeled psychedelic, hallucinogenic, or entheogenic as frontiers denotes them as specific kinds of material spaces where normal understandings of order and of permissible behavior within the heavily policed and disciplined metropole do not apply. Yet it also entails stripping plants of their statuses as living conscious actors, framing them entirely in terms of their potential values as commodities for human consumption. This divorces the chemical signals produced by plants to mediate relationships with other organisms from their broader ecological context, rendering them as discrete, exploitable active ingredients. The metropolitan elites often criticized the lawlessness of settlers in the early North American West, who violated legally binding treaty agreements and used extra-legal violence to dispossess indigenous people of their lands. The U.S. federal government almost always later supported the territorial claims of the intruders, allowing new spaces to become frontiers. Programs aimed at coercing indigenous people's participation in capitalist labor and natural resource markets followed, promoting the ecological relationships these systems used to rationalize the industrial exploitation and regimentation of the global biosphere. The designation of psychedelic space as an inner frontier came not just from members of the North American counterculture, however, but from governments interested in defending against imagined Soviet prowess and brainwashing, and pharmaceutical companies interested in designing new medicines. As on past frontiers, metropolitan elites tolerated illegality and unethical behavior in the exploration of the space, offering amnesty to doctors from Nazi Germany who carried out experiments with mescaline on human test subjects, and allowing CIA agents to secretly administer LSD to civilians in underground research stations. During the early parts of this post-World War II period, researchers traveled to previously isolated indigenous people groups like the Mazatec in northern Oaxaca or the Yanomami on the Venezuela-Brazil borderlands to participate in Native American religious ceremonies and document the applications of once stigmatized plants. Operating in close contact with the functionaries of state-sponsored development and national integration initiatives, such professional researchers often expressed disdain for the use of psychedelic plants by the counterculture and blamed the counterculture for catalyzing a movement towards prohibition. Yet after international drug control treaties placed the classical psychedelics in the most restricted category, the continuation of what many still saw as a legitimate research agenda depended on the activities of underground therapists, amateur psychonauts, and other actors conventionally associated with the counterculture. Within this context, plants that initially appeared marginal to the first wave of institutional researchers became reinterpreted as tools to circumvent the legal restrictions placed on the more well-known psychedelics. Interest in indigenous psychedelic plants among the counterculture traces in part to French poet Antonin Artaud's 1935 search for peyote among the Raramuri in Mexico. Amid growing discontent among the working and middle classes with the conditions of industrialized Western societies, the consumption of visionary plants used among indigenous people seemed to open up new spaces for rebellion. Yet despite idealizing and often expressing sympathy with indigenous people, the psychedelic counterculture nonetheless accepted and by extension reinforced many of the underlying assumptions of settler colonialism and American capitalism. Harvard psychologist and self-described high priest of the psychedelic counterculture, Timothy Leary, for instance, celebrated his early research into psychedelics as, quote, democratic with a dash of the frontier spirit, close quote, in his autobiography, and frequently expressed his admiration for, quote, pioneers, close quote, of the American West. Leary even praised Christopher Columbus for his, quote, sense of genetic mission, close quote, in the dedication to the book The Politics of Self-Determination. Advocating that humanity was destined to colonize other planets, Leary embraced an interpretation of human evolution that saw the species as divided into east and west spinning gene pools, causing the most free-thinking and intelligent humans, indicated by their ability to master the LSD experience, to move west, where they would form the vanguard of interplanetary migration as a caste of genetically and intellectually superior psychedelic elite. He featured a graphic depicting this process in his 1979 book, The Intelligence Agents, which showed a, quote, genetic runway, close quote, culminating in the state of California, which was depicted detached from the rest of the continent. Though the countercultural discourse tends to understand indigenous relationships with visionary plants as ancient precursors to modern use by non-indigenous psychonauts, with contemporary anthropologists able to seamlessly recover fossilized ancient traditions to inform their practices, this narrative assumption overlooks the historical complexities of the context in which their use developed. One person I spoke with this January traced the Mazatec relationship with Xka Chon Titjon to 500 BCE, when the highland parts of the Sierra remained sparsely populated by decentralized bands, known to the neighboring Zapotec, Mixtec, and Olmec civilizations for their sacred caves, used for rainmaking ceremonies since roughly 0 CE. The word Xka means leaf, the phrase Chon Titjon means female guide. The plant tends to grow in areas with flowing water, offering a visual cue capable of guiding people seeking nourishment. Combined with its ability to provide access to otherwise invisible levels of reality, its ability to guide people towards water made it an important political ally for the nobility in the theocratic societies that consolidated power over the region, from urban hubs in present-day Mazatlan Villa de Flores, and later Huautla de Jimenez between 0 and 1100 CE. Only grown in the Sierra, local elites protected knowledge about the plant from outsiders through the conquest by the Mexica Triple Alliance in 1350 and by the Spanish in 1521. When a 1962 ethnobotanical expedition led by Harvard research fellow R. Gordon Wasson sought flowering specimens of Hojas de la Pastora to facilitate identification, he described an aura of secrecy around his visits to live populations of the plant, with one curandera who led him through a ceremony, begging for forgiveness after it concluded. Wasson often recognized that his presence represented a breach of local boundaries, yet believed that the advance of modernity, represented by the regional development projects carried out by the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, would inevitably cause knowledge about the plant to disappear. Seated on the American branch of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which marketed LSD and which had previously isolated psilocybin from the Mesoamerican sacred mushroom Teonanacatl, he recognized potential economic and medicinal values to learning about the inner workings of Hojas de la Pastora. After some difficulty securing adequate specimens, Wasson forwarded material he collected to University of California botanist Carl Epling, who named the plant Salvia divinorum. In the mechanistic terms of Western science, assigning the plant a binomial name signified its transformation into a natural resource, implicitly a non-person. After accompanying Wasson in 1962, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann of Sandoz returned to his laboratory with samples of Xka pastora to attempt to extract the active ingredient. Though Hofmann failed, chemists in Mexico City and Michigan independently claimed to isolate an active ingredient, a diterpenoid molecule named salvinorin A, by 1983. The pharmacology of this molecule presented a profound challenge to then current medical understandings of what international drug laws had termed hallucinogens. It contained no nitrogen, considered a prerequisite for psychoactivity, and lacked any affinity for serotonin, understood to be the primary target of such compounds. Linguistic anthropologist Paha Fadri previously characterized non-indigenous approaches to Xka pastora in terms of semiotic stripping away of meanings, in contrast to the Mazatec enrobing of the plant in meaning. However, the process of settler naming, categorization, and interrogation did not simply strip the plant of its original meanings, but also enrobed it in new meanings by associating it with scientific and spiritual puzzles that positioned it as a frontier for settler expansion. After Hofmann and Epling cultivated the plant in institutionally sanctioned spaces of laboratories, it gradually moved into legally gray spaces of amateur experimentation and the controlled growing conditions required for the legal highs industry. The slow and cumulative methods used by Mazatec curanderos to develop relationships with Xka Chon Titjon require a great deal of patience to progress from learning to speak the voice of the leaf, which was a quote, speak the voice of the leaf, a quote, to traveling beyond the plane of consensus reality. In fact, Mexican ethnopharmacologist Jose Luis Diaz described his efforts to study the use of the plant under a Mazatec curandera in the early 1970s as humbling due to the technical skill required to use it. From its identification by Epling in 1962 onward to the 1990s, its uncertain and delicate effects left psychedelic plant aficionados with the sense that it offered only a relatively unimpressive mild trip. However, in 1993, a young white Californian psychonaut named Daniel Siebert followed instructions printed in a dissertation 10 years earlier to extract and experiment with pure salvinorin A. His article, published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology the following year, reported that inhaling as little as 200 micrograms of salvinorin A induced the same effects as the raw leaves. This established the molecule as one of the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogenic molecules ever discovered, provoking wonder among leading figures in the underground psychedelic community. Terence McKenna, a popular author on entheogens in the 90s, used the story of Siebert's discovery to draw attention to the possibility of finding other potential botanical routes for exploring the mysteries of inner transpersonal mind-manifesting space. As word spread on early message boards that chewing or drinking the whole leaves produced inconsistent effects, users gradually shifted to smoking dried Salvia divinorum leaves enhanced with the crude extract of salvinorin A. Though this offered a more rapid and intense experience, It also required the indoor cultivation of large numbers of plants, a pesticide and water-intensive process, since the mixture of diterpenoids in the plant's leaves evolved immediate relationships with a region-specific, seasonally fluctuating population of insects. It depends on vegetative cloning over pollination as a reproductive strategy, which means that the plant at times encourages limited feeding by certain herbivores, making it vulnerable to insects from outside of the Sierra Mazateca. By 1998, people could purchase smokable salvia products at smart shops in the Netherlands. That same year, Details magazine, a popular publication with young adults around the turn of the millennium, touted the plant as, quote, the new ecstasy. Though Siebert acknowledged that a Mazatec curandera told him that smoking the plant's leaves would be, quote, equivalent to burning your own children, close quote, in an interview printed on his website, Sage Wisdom, he nonetheless sold standardized smokable extracts through a digital storefront attached to the same website. Given the prominence of Siebert's statement about Mazatec prohibitions against smoking on a site that until recently had served as one of the most successful sellers of Salvia divinorum products, the question of whether to smoke the plant or to follow a more traditional route by chewing the leaf material frequently triggers debate on the online web forum R Salvia, a subreddit with around 33,500 subscribers. Formed in August 2009 in the midst of a moral panic over the use of salvia products by high school students, the forum invites, quote, reports, art, questions, and things that evoke that salvia feeling, close quote. Questions about the proper way to consume the plant provoked among white American users stem from what Australian academic Lisa Slater refers to as settler anxiety. If users in settler societies are conscious of the genocidal campaigns of extermination reinforced by state-sponsored violence in the places they live, and this may depend on their public school system, questions about who has the right to use Xka Pastora provoke broader uncertainties about the legitimacy of settler presence on indigenous land, as well as about the legitimacy of settler usage of indigenous sacred plants, clothing, or design aesthetics. The discourse surrounding the correct way to use Salvia divinorum shows a range of coping strategies for this anxiety, with some dismissing Mazatec claims to the plant and others urging respect. In one of 121 comments made in response to a December 30th, 2021 post titled, "Do you guys actually believe Salvia dislikes being burnt?" one user asks if the Mazatec only prohibits smoking due to, quote, fear of the potent experiences that could be reached through the practice, close quote, which they believe, quote, artificially limits the exploration of consciousness. A respondent who called out, quote, comments disparaging Mazatec culture, close quote, for, quote, reflecting a colonizer mentality, close quote, was accused by another of virtue signaling and downvoted. Some defenders of smoking point to the plant's alleged lack of consciousness or ability to have a preference altogether, dismissing Mazatec understandings of the plant as, quote, superstitious nonsense, close quote. Significantly, the debate itself centers almost entirely around Siebert's reported exchange with a single informant named Donna Julieta, presumed to have authority to represent the entirety of the Mazatec view. Decades prior to Siebert's visit, Mazatec merchants were willingly selling the leaves to Mexican youth who were then going on to smoke it. Although Siebert dismisses these individuals as, quote, less scrupulous, close quote, in his 1999 interview, where the claim about smoking initially appeared, his own website nonetheless sold extract-enhanced Salvia divinorum for $45 per gram in 2001, the equivalent of about 420 Mexican pesos, or 29.5% the average monthly salary of a Mexican worker during that year. The average salary would be lower in the Sierra Mazateca. While expressions of sympathy for the Mazatec are frequent in our Salvia, they tend to be spoken of in past tense as a, quote, ancient people, close quote, ignoring their continued existence or deeper history in favor of a narrative emphasizing their statuses as exemplars of a static and homogeneous tradition. As Lisa Slater observes with, quote, good white people, close quote, in Australia, the projection of sympathy represented by the effort to demonstrate respect for traditional practices rarely develops into meaningful solidarity with indigenous political demands. Instead, the prospect of indigenous political agency appears to threaten settler enjoyment, it's perceived to, or in the case of smoked Salvinorin A, which is not considered enjoyable generally, at least it seems to threaten settler exploration of a place that they claim to cherish and value. Though the private exploration of inner space through Salvia divinorum outwardly appears to align with the counterculture then, the trip reports, which can be found online, provide institutional researchers seeking clearer understandings of pharmacology or consciousness with free publicly available human data that would require extensive ethical approval to obtain in conventional laboratory settings. Siebert, for instance, collaborated with Case Western Reserve University pharmacologist Brian Roth in 2003 to confirm the activity of Salvinorin A at the kappa opioid receptor through a self-experiment using the opioid receptor blocker naloxone. This research eventually enabled Roth and his team of researchers to produce a detailed model of the kappa opioid receptor. Within this discourse surrounding the exploration of the plant, the image of the Mazatec curandero as the vessel of an unchanging, ancient, indigenous knowledge, wholly distinct from science, justifies a status quo where the primary economic benefits of the knowledge go to vendors like Siebert or to researchers at foreign institutions. So in conclusion, the American counterculture, dominated by a population of restless white middle-class youth, blossomed in places along the Pacific coast in the 1960s, where only a few generations had passed since campaigns of violent extermination and relocation that marked the early phases of frontier expansion. Yet just as the violence of settler colonialism persisted in the legal structures and built environments of settler cities and towns, the frontier persisted as a guiding meta-narrative channeling unrest and rebellion towards the extension of state power into new territories, both inside and outside the geophysical boundaries of the nation-state as represented on a map. A plant from present-day Mexico, the identification of Xka Chon Titjon and its active principle appeared a promising frontier for so-called basement shamans in the United States. Though superficially stating opposition to the mainstream, the counterculture relied on core assumptions of settler colonial capitalism to defend their continued use of plants like Xka Chon Titjon, and often contributes inadvertently or intentionally to research projects aimed at enhancing the extension of bourgeois power over the environment and the mind. Gestures that respect only assuage settler anxieties if not accompanied by meaningful solidarity. This means recognizing the continued existence of Mazatec farm workers and urban laborers and finding ways to align with their political and economic demands, which include not only region-specific issues like land sovereignty, linguistic survival, or an end to state repression of local left-wing political activity, but also the rights of migrant workers from the Sierra Mazateca in the United States. So thank you, that was my paper. Did the other panelists join, or if not, thank you. Does anyone have any questions or feedback?